Viewers around the world, buckle up, because tonight we are tearing down the farce aid. When a world leader steps onto the podium of the United Nations and speaks, he expects to be believed. He expects gravitas, trust, legitimacy. But what happens when that leader turns truth into theater, when facts become footnotes, and when the stage becomes a mask? Tonight we expose Netanyahu's lies at the UN, not as theory, not as rhetoric, but with facts, real evidence, and unflinching scrutiny. You're not going to get a warmed-over speech. You're getting the raw, unvarnished truth. When Netanyahu stood at the UN General Assembly and dismissed accusations of genocide in Gaza, he tried to paint a picture of Israel as the opposite of a force bent on destruction. He insisted that orders to evacuate civilians, his government's messaging to Gazans, and Israel's selective strikes were proof that his military was acting with restraint. He told the world with a straight face that genocide was not only an absurd charge, but an inversion of reality. But the problem with speeches delivered under the glare of global cameras is that facts don't simply vanish, and the record of events in Gaza cannot be rewritten by rhetorical flair alone. The international community has evidence that contradicts him at every turn, and what he labels as baseless accusations is in fact documented testimony from rights groups, journalists, and even Israel's own internal data. Independent investigations reveal something Netanyahu refused to admit: the overwhelming number of victims in Gaza have been civilians. The figure that emerged from Israel's own database, quietly exposed by the media, showed that roughly 83% of those killed were not militants, but ordinary people. Men, women, and children who were trapped in one of the most densely populated territories on Earth. That is not the statistic of a carefully executed campaign of precision. It is the signature of a war machine grinding down a population. When a prime minister claims that the charges of genocide are nothing more than anti-Israel bias, he is not simply dodging criticism, he is rewriting reality in real time. The world saw the rubble, the mass graves, the endless funerals, the desperate pleas from doctors who had no anesthesia, no electricity, no clean water, yet were forced to treat children pulled from bombed-out homes. These images were not propaganda manufactured in some hidden basement. They were broadcast live by international networks and confirmed by humanitarian agencies. If this was Israel, doing the opposite of genocide, as Netanyahu framed it, then the phrase itself has lost all meaning. Because genocide is not only about gas chambers or concentration camps, it is also about systematically destroying the ability of a people to live, to thrive, and to survive. At The Hague, the International Court of Justice has already taken seriously the accusation that Israel's conduct in Gaza may meet the legal threshold for genocide. That does not happen on a whim. It happens when judges are presented with credible evidence, sworn testimony, and mountains of data pointing to deliberate acts that fit within the grim definition. Netanyahu tried to shrug this off by claiming that the real criminals are his enemies, that the narrative has been twisted to vilify Israel, but dismissing the world's highest judicial body as biased only further undermines his credibility. In the UN chamber, his words may have sparked applause from loyal allies, but outside those walls, the evidence stood taller than his speech. Civilian death tolls, documented starvation, deliberate displacement. These are not inventions of Israel's critics, they are realities witnessed by the entire globe. Netanyahu's denial does not erase the truth, it merely exposes his fear of it. When Netanyahu stood at the podium and declared that Israel was not blocking aid to Gaza, he framed starvation and shortages as the result of theft by Hamas. He wanted the world to believe that his government was the enabler of humanitarian relief, and that if children were going hungry, it was because food was being hijacked by militants. It is a claim that sounds clean and convenient, but like much of his UN speech, it collapses under the weight of evidence. Humanitarian agencies, journalists, and aid workers on the ground have repeatedly testified that Israel has imposed severe restrictions on aid deliveries, creating long lines of trucks at border crossings while supplies inside Gaza dwindle. For months, footage has shown convoys of aid trucks stuck at Rafah or Kerem Shalom, waiting for clearance that never came or moving at a trickle compared to the desperate needs of the population. Independent reports detail how Israel has at times imposed full blockades, halting fuel, medicine, and even food under the justification of security concerns. These choke points are not minor inconveniences, they are deliberate levers of control. The result has been a population pushed to the brink of famine, hospitals unable to operate, and children suffering from malnutrition. Yet at the UN, Netanyahu chose to tell the world that none of this was Israel's doing. The claim that Hamas steals aid is not new. Israeli officials have repeated it as a refrain, but whenever the United Nations, the Red Cross, or international NGOs are asked, the response has been that while there have been isolated incidents of diversion, the overwhelming problem is the sheer lack of aid allowed in. What good is a bag of flour if hundreds of thousands never receive it, because it is sitting on the wrong side of a checkpoint? The idea that militants are hoarding supplies may serve as a useful scapegoat in political speeches, but it does not match the daily realities reported by those working inside Gaza's collapsing humanitarian system. The blockade extends beyond food. Fuel deliveries, essential for running generators that keep hospitals alive, have been restricted or delayed. Water purification systems have collapsed under bombardment and shortages. Even aid convoys that did cross were sometimes bombed or obstructed. These are not the hallmarks of a government facilitating relief. They are the signs of a system designed to pressure and punish an entire population. Netanyahu's effort to reframe this as Hamas's fault is not just misleading, it is an erasure of the direct role Israel plays in the suffering. And when he insists that Israel is blameless, he ignores the testimonies of his own allies. American officials, European diplomats, and humanitarian organizations have all voiced frustration at the slow pace of aid approvals and the arbitrary limits placed on what could be delivered. The evidence is so consistent, so overwhelming, that the narrative of Hamas as the singular villain in the aid crisis rings hollow. Netanyahu's claim may work for sound bites, but it cannot stand against the lived reality of Gaza's people. When children are starving and hospitals run dark, the world knows where the blockade begins. Netanyahu's speech at the United Nations was less a statesman's address and more a performance crafted for television audiences and his political base. He arrived not just with words, but with props, maps, charts, QR codes, and banners that turned the solemn floor of the UN into something resembling a political rally. He displayed a graphic titled, "The Curse," to dramatize the threat he claims Israel faces, plastered maps of the Middle East that exaggerated Iran's influence, and even used QR codes as though delegates were members of a marketing seminar rather than representatives of sovereign states. These theatrics were not accidental. They were deliberate tools of narrative control, meant to overwhelm the audience with spectacle and bypass the uncomfortable reality of the accusations against him. Theatrics at the UN are not unprecedented, but Netanyahu has mastered them. Years ago, he held up a cartoonish drawing of a bomb to warn the world about Iran's nuclear program. This time, he used similar gimmicks to distract from the charges of war crimes and genocide that hang over his head. By flooding the stage with images and props, he hoped to divert attention from the devastating civilian toll in Gaza and the legal proceedings at the International Criminal Court. It was a strategy. If you cannot erase the facts, bury them under theatrics. The problem is that these gimmicks reveal more than they hide. They show a leader less interested in dialogue and accountability, and more focused on shaping a story for the cameras. His maps reduced complex geopolitical realities into black and white images of threats and curses, erasing nuance and flattening decades of history into a simple versus them tale. His QR codes were a novelty, but what substance did they actually offer? Delegates were not there to scan marketing material. They were there to listen to arguments of law and morality. The gimmicks made his address look like a staged production rather than a defense of policy. This is a pattern. Netanyahu has long understood that politics in the 21st century is not just about policy but about performance. Every prop is designed to be clipped, shared, and broadcast on social media. Every dramatic pause, every raised graphic is crafted to grab headlines back home, where his political survival often depends on rallying nationalist sentiment. At the UN, he was not really speaking to the diplomats in the room, many of whom walked out in protest, but to the cameras beaming his message to Israeli households and sympathetic media outlets abroad. But narrative control has its limits. Theatrics can capture attention, but they cannot erase the fact that dozens of delegations stood up and left mid-speech, a visible rejection of his message. They cannot mask the reality that while he spoke of curses and threats, humanitarian agencies were documenting famine and devastation in Gaza. They cannot erase the fact that his props and slogans were designed to distract, not to explain. In the end, the props may win him applause among supporters, but they only underscore the hollowness of his arguments. For a man fighting accusations of crimes against humanity, paper maps and cartoonish slogans are not defenses. They are signs of desperation. When Netanyahu took the stage at the UN, he may have hoped to project the image of a defiant leader standing tall against his critics. But the optics told a very different story. One by one, delegations rose from their seats and walked out. Some did so quietly, others in visible protest, leaving behind rows of empty chairs that stood as a silent indictment of his words. For all the dramatic props and fiery rhetoric, the message the world delivered back to him was unmistakable. His credibility on the global stage is collapsing. These walkouts were not minor acts of diplomacy. They were symbolic gestures of rejection, a public statement that his narrative no longer commands respect. This isolation is not happening in a vacuum. Over the past year, Israel's actions in Gaza have drawn widespread condemnation, not only from adversaries but from allies who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Netanyahu's government. European nations that historically defended Israel at international forums are now calling for accountability. Latin American countries have recalled ambassadors. African and Asian states have openly criticized the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza. Even the United States, Israel's staunchest backer, has found itself increasingly on the defensive, facing domestic and international pressure to rein in its ally. Netanyahu's speech was supposed to repair that fractured image, but the walkouts only magnified the growing sense of global alienation. What makes this moment particularly striking is the legal shadow that hangs over Netanyahu himself. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for him on charges including the use of starvation as a weapon of war. When a head of government speaks at the UN while facing an international arrest warrant, the very act becomes an exercise in damage control. Yet instead of addressing the charges directly with transparency or contrition, Netanyahu doubled down on denial and deflection. That decision may have pleased his domestic audience, but to the diplomats in the hall, it reeked of evasion. The walkouts were not just about Gaza, they were about a deeper erosion of trust in his word. Credibility once lost is not easily regained. The UN chamber is not just a stage for national theatrics, it is a venue where legitimacy is tested in real time. When diplomats leave en masse, it signals that they no longer consider the speaker a reliable voice of truth or morality. Netanyahu's problem is not just that his policies are controversial, it is that his explanations are increasingly dismissed as propaganda. Empty chairs in that chamber spoke louder than his carefully rehearsed lines, showing a leader whose audience is shrinking by the day. The collapse of credibility is a dangerous thing for a nation that relies heavily on international alliances and aid. Israel's security, economy, and diplomatic influence are tied to the trust of others. If Netanyahu's words can no longer command that trust, he risks isolating not just himself but his entire country. And while walkouts may seem symbolic, history shows that such acts often foreshadow deeper fractures. Trade restrictions, diplomatic freezes, and loss of support in critical votes. What happened in that UN chamber was not merely a moment of embarrassment, it was a snapshot of a leader and a nation sliding into unprecedented isolation. So where do we go from here? We don't remain silent. We don't accept grand speeches at face value. If a man claims the moral high ground but floors the hall with emptiness, we call it out. If a leader wields megaphones into Gaza while starving its people, we demand accountability. If lies are dressed as policy, we reject them. To every viewer listening now, your skepticism is your strength. Demand sources, demand evidence. Don't drown in emotions, swim in facts. Because tonight, we've pulled back the curtain on Netanyahu's UN lies. And if we can see behind the show, we can refuse to be complicit in the silence. The world watches. History judges. Let truth win. Thank you, and remember, nobody is above truth.